If you're not familiar with what God is doing inside of China, today we are experiencing the world's largest revival. I've had the privilege of working together with the Chinese for the last 2 decades. And today I come before you not as someone that is a leader of any organization or a strategy or someone who is a famous speaker or able to put together a 12-point plan on completing missions. Instead, I come to you as kind of a hobbyist in history, an observer. Someone who has witnessed what is taking place in history with the underground church. As they've been experiencing revivals in China, they have sent missionaries out into many nations where I have had the privilege of going together with them and serving with them. And that has, in many ways, brought us in a crossroads together with Flame. You see, I didn't go to Sudan because I had a vision for Sudan. I was working together with the Chinese underground church, and they had a vision for Sudan, and they asked me to help to prepare a way, a platform for them to go and serve in Sudan. And we worked together with Flame International as Flame shared with us their vision, took us to the field, shared with us the work that they were doing in Sudan, and then helped provide that platform for the Chinese to leave from China as missionaries and go to Sudan. And as I look at this verse of Matthew 24:14, I am reminded of the return of Jesus Christ. How many people here want to see the return of Jesus Christ? Amen. If you truly want to see the return of Jesus Christ, Jesus made it crystal clear when he would return again. We in the church, we make it complicated sometimes. We in the church like to come up with special formulas. We in the church oftentimes like to make it a little bit more complicated. We like to read into the signs of what is happening. We watch the news and we say, oh, this must be the end times. We see the wars and the rumors of wars, and we see the earthquakes and the natural disasters in various places, and we say, oh, this is a sign of the end time. We see what's happening in Israel with the battles that are taking place in the Middle East. And we turn to the book of Revelation and we dig out those old CDs or those old cassettes. And we start to listen to those teachers from the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s that said, if you play certain music backwards. Everyone here, I think, is old enough to know what I'm talking about. And there's been all these different teachings that if you take the number of Hebrew characters in the Old Testament and you multiply them by 10, and then you find the square root and you multiply that by the number of blood moons, then you will know the day that Jesus is returning again. But Jesus didn't make it difficult. He said very simply, when the disciples came to him in Matthew chapter 24 and said, when will these things take place? Jesus said, when the good news is preached to all the nations, all the ethnos groups, all the people groups, then the end will come. So if we truly want to see the return of Jesus Christ, we have to take the good news to the nations that have yet to hear this gospel of the kingdom. Now, I don't know the story of many of you, but for me, I didn't grow up in a Christian family. I grew up, my father died when I was about a year old. My mother married and remarried about 5 different times. I grew up in a home that was not a Christian home. So I never went to church as a family. It wasn't until I became a believer at 14 that I first started going to church, and it was all new for me. Now, I didn't know what I was. In fact, my background is in the military, much like Jan. So when I was in the military, I had to write down what my religion was. And I thought, I was just a Christian. So I looked for Christian on the list, and Christian was not on that list. You had to choose whether you were a Lutheran or a Baptist or a Methodist. I didn't know what I was, but I saw Pentecostal in there. And I thought, there was a Pentecostal church. I remember that name. So I chose it. And it said on my tags, one on my boot, one on my chest, just in case my body gets separated from itself, they'll know exactly how to bury me. And it said Pentecostal. And then I went to the very first Pentecostal church because I thought that's where I belonged. And when I started to see the people pray, I thought, oh, what did I sign up for? I didn't know this is what I was. The very first time I go into this church, I remember hearing this pastor pray for the return of Jesus Christ. And I was a new believer. So as the pastor does, I did as well. So the pastor pleaded, Jesus return, Jesus return, Jesus return. And I thought, that's what I'm supposed to do. So I cried out, Jesus return. I joined together with him. And I said, Jesus return, Jesus return, Jesus return. And then I began to think, I'm only 14. I've got some sins I would like to be forgiven for before Jesus returns. I would like to know what it's like to have a driver's license and drive a car. I would like to know what it's like to get married. Jesus, you have waited 2,000 years. Would it be impossible to wait just a little bit longer? And I remember that pastor just passionately crying out, Jesus return, Jesus, with such zeal that I thought, man, this pastor might actually be in trouble for a crime and wants Jesus to come before the police do. Like the pleading that he was doing, I started to think, maybe this is not what I want for my prayer. But as I began to travel and work together with the underground church inside of China, work in places like Sudan, like Somalia, travel into North Korea and Iran, working together with the Chinese underground house church pastors, I started to see misery in a world without Christ. Such suffering that I realized that only Christ could bring about a change. That only Christ could end that suffering. And then I too began to chant the same words as that passionate pastor that night that I heard him say for the very first time, Jesus return, Jesus return, Jesus return. That now is my prayer as well. But if that is our prayer, if we truly want to see the return of Jesus Christ, he has told us exactly how to usher it in. When this good news of the kingdom has been preached to all the nations, then the end will come. We are not playing a passive role in this life. Christ gave us the Great Commission so that we are to preach the good news to the nations that have not yet heard the good news. It's been 2,000 years. 2,000 years since Christ gave the command to his disciples. 2,000 years since he gave the Great Commission. 2,000 years since he said, till all of the nations hear this gospel of the kingdom. How are we doing? How close have we come to completing the Great Commission? Where are we at? If we were to measure where we are in the world today, where would we come on a timeline of completing that Great Commission? The Chinese have this vision that they call back to Jerusalem, and the main focus is the area between China and Jerusalem. This area is where we see 2/3 of the world's population. Believe it or not, 2/3 of the world's population do not live in the UK. Though they may be trying to travel through London Heathrow in the next 24 or 48 hours. 2/3 of the world's population live in the area between China and Jerusalem. 9 out of every 10 people who've never heard the gospel, even one time, live between China and Jerusalem. This area is the final frontier of missions. This area along the ancient Silk Road, which I think you'll probably be hearing a lot about this weekend from the other speakers. This region is the area where the gospel has yet to penetrate. If we want to see the good news preached to all the nations, this has to be our focus. How can we complete it in our lifetime? What do we need to do? What can we do together to complete the Great Commission? Because it's never been as possible before as it is today. It has never been a better time in the history of Christianity to be a Christian as it is today. It has never been a better time to be a missionary. We've never been able to go further, deeper, faster in the history of mankind as we can today. I can get on a plane in my home in China and fly to Chicago and land 2 hours before I left. I can sit and talk with people from around the world all at the same time on the internet. I can transfer information from one place to another in the blink of an eye. I've never been so empowered as I am right now. The church has never had so many resources as it does right now. So, how can we complete the Great Commission in our lifetime? Well, there's a few ideas, and I'm not going to be very popular for what I'm going to say in the next 20 minutes. But if you ask most people, what do we need to complete the Great Commission? Most mission organizations will say, pray for resources. Pray for more donations. Pray for more money. If we had more money, we could reach more people. If we had more money, we could print more Bibles. If we had more money, we could travel to more regions. This area between China and Jerusalem is where we have the most unreached people groups in the world today. And yet, Christians spend the least amount of resources for missions. I don't know what the numbers are here in the UK. But in the US, with the latest data that we have, out of every $100 given to missions, not given to the church, but specifically given to missions, out of every $100 given to missions, only 2 pennies goes to reach the unreached people groups of the world, and only 1 penny goes to the region between China and Jerusalem. To put that in perspective, last year Christians spent more money on Halloween costumes for their dogs than what we spent on the Great Commission to get the gospel into the people that have not yet heard the good news. Do we really want to see the return of Jesus Christ? You know, a lot of people will pray that, God, if we only had the finances, if we only had the resources. You know, Christians make up only 1/3 of the world's population, and yet we control 2/3 of the world's resources. So if your prayer was that God would give his people the resources they need to complete the Great Commission, congratulations, your prayer has been answered. So if it's not money, it must be people. The harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. If we only had a few more people that would go and serve on the field, more people to go and preach the gospel, more people to join in the end time missions. If we had more people, then we would see the completion of the Great Commission in our lifetime. The most recent data shows that there's about 78,000 Christians for every single unreached people group. Roughly about 9,000 churches for every unreached people group. But Christians are more likely to get run over. True story. Christians are more likely to get run over by a horse cart than to serve as a missionary in the region between China and Jerusalem. We have the people. We have the resources. What are we missing? Well, if we've got the money, if we've got the resources, and we've got the people, it must be the training. If we only had better training, then we could reach the lost. We've never had so many resources at our fingertips. I can study how to do missions at home without wearing pants and learn how to reach the lost and closed countries for free using YouTube, Google search. There are more than 900 Christian universities that offer some sort of degree online for doing missions. We've never had so much training available at our fingertips. All we have to do is summon it, and it's there. The training is there. The people are there. The finances are there. What do we need to complete the Great Commission in our lifetime? I'm not going to pretend that I know. But I can tell you that I, as a witness, sitting and watching the sacrifice of the underground church inside of China, I've learned something that I find interesting, that there's one thing, if there's one thing that we need, that we can adopt, that we can learn from the persecuted church, the one thing that I have seen is something that you can't buy, something that you can't train for. It is the Holy Spirit. We need the Spirit of God in our lives like never before to complete the Great Commission. Have you ever asked yourself why is it? Jesus was born 2,000 years ago. Would anybody here argue that Jesus, the message of Jesus was not the greatest message that mankind has ever heard? I believe it is. I was sitting with a rehab group this week outside of Rotherham. It turns out that Flame and a rehab group are the only two groups crazy enough to ask me to come and speak. So I went to this rehab group, and I was sharing, and I was asking them, why is it that Jesus didn't come today? Doesn't it seem odd that he came 2,000 years ago? I mean, think about Christ, the greatest message mankind has ever heard. And he didn't write it down in a book? He could have come today in the year 2025, and his message would have gone out instantaneously all around the world in multiple languages. Individuals that did not speak Aramaic could have just used Google Translate or some sort of AI and listened to his word in real time in their own language. And they would have never had to travel to Judea. They could have stayed exactly where they were. I've been around the world, and almost everybody has a mobile phone. Almost everybody has access to the internet. Almost everybody has access to some sort of communication device. Why 2,000 years ago? Christ could have had his own Facebook page, his own YouTube channel. He could have gotten this word out instantaneously all around the world without even sweating it. He wouldn't have needed a good marketing team. He wouldn't have needed fishermen, people that are incapable of sharing such a grand story with the rest of mankind that was supposed to take root forever. He left it with some pretty incompetent individuals. Why 2,000 years ago? Why didn't he write it down? Why didn't he save it in an archive somewhere? I believe it was because he showed his disciples how to use the Spirit, not writing it down in a book, not putting together a 5-part plan, not putting together a 12-step program, but writing the message of the gospel onto the hearts of other believers. That's what Flame does, face-to-face interaction, heart-to-heart connection, not just writing it down on a piece of paper, but writing it on the hearts of other individuals in a way that they will never forget, and then telling them to go and do the same face-to-face, heart to heart. The Spirit can prepare you for things that no training program can ever do. I've worked together. I brought a few books with me that we have at Back to Jerusalem, in case you are curious about any of the things that we have done in the area of China, between China and Jerusalem. One of the guys that I have had the privilege of working together with since the 1990s is a guy called the Heavenly Man. Has anybody here heard of the Heavenly Man before? Okay, so most people. Brother Yun came, I was working for the police department in Southern California when I met him for the first time. And the one thing that I've learned by witnessing his life is that he walks daily in the Spirit. And the Spirit does things through him that I don't think you could ever be trained to do. He's able to answer questions that he could have never been prepared for. Questions that when he gets asked, I get nervous because we work together. And there are times where I think that he says the most silly things to the most sophisticated people, and I feel embarrassed. I'm often embarrassed when I'm traveling together with him, and because we're just on two completely different levels. He's an amazing Christian, and I'm not. So when we're traveling together, there are times where we will go on in the airplane, and I know that he wants to preach the gospel wherever he goes. And I don't. I want to sleep on the plane. I in some ways, I might relate more to the British than the Americans because I don't want to talk to my neighbor. I don't want to have a conversation with the person next to me. Brother Yun does, but he can't speak the language. So he wants me to do the translation. So I always go up to the counter before our flight, and I always ask the people at the counter, is it possible that you put him to a seat as far front as you can find? And then for me, as far back as you can go. Because I know that in the middle of the flight, he will begin to sing. He can't speak English, but he knows a couple of words. Two very important words. Hallelujah and amen. And he will put out his arms, hitting the face of each passenger on each side, praising and worshiping God loudly and proudly without shame. But there's something in my socialization programming from the West where it just doesn't fit right. I don't like it. And when he's asked questions that are a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more new agey, if you will, I want him to give a more sophisticated answer. Case in point, one time we were traveling and there was a French reporter who came up to Brother Yun and asked him, can you please give us a comment on how you feel about animal rights in China? I thought, oh no, this is a brother that enjoys eating dog. This is not going to go well. And Brother Yun just simply said, China needs Jesus. Now I thought that's the most cheesy answer I can think of. I mean, China needs Jesus. Okay, that's not a real answer. Let's just try to escape this situation. But the French reporter was persistent. And they said, please, Brother Yun, give us a quote. How do you feel about the abuse of animals in China? What is your stance on animal rights? And Brother Yun said it again. China needs Jesus. And then he began to elaborate. And he said, you see, Jesus made the animals. And Jesus loves his creation. The more we are more like Jesus, the more we love that which he creates. So if you want more love for animals, you bring them more love through Jesus. Because those that have the love of Jesus love that which God has created. That will bring animal rights to China. Oh, wow, that was an amazing message. He saved us. It sounded amazing, but it wasn't prepared. It was by the Spirit that he was being led. I remember one time we were sitting in a room not much different than the size of this room here. And we had a group of pastors from St. Louis, Missouri. And I remember 2019, we were seeing an increase of persecution in China. In fact, since 2019 until today, we've seen more persecution in the last 6 years than in the last 2 decades in China. And the pastors had many questions about this increase of persecution. And one of the pastors said, Brother Yun, can you tell us? We've been hearing that in China, they are tearing down the crosses. How does that make you feel? And Brother Yun says, it's okay by me. I don't think it's a bad thing. I thought, oh, we are bringing new heresy now. We are going to get kicked out of this room. What do you mean? Please don't explain. Let's just hope they don't pay attention and we can move on to the next question. And the pastor said, you mean to tell me that you think it's a good thing that the Chinese government is tearing down the crosses of the buildings? Brother Yun says, yes, that's what I mean. And then he said, Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. The cross was supposed to be on the backs of his people. We are to pick it up every day, not take a break by resting it on the building. That cross was never supposed to be resting on top of a building. It was supposed to be carried on our backs. Whew. That doesn't sound like a bad answer. He saved us. But then the pastor followed up and he said, yeah, but we've also been hearing reports that they're tearing down buildings in China. Surely that's not a good thing. And he said, I don't see it as a bad thing. I think tearing down church buildings inside of China is not a bad thing. I thought, oh, please save us. Come up with another good answer. And in the spirit, I could just see him without even thinking about it. He said, we are seeing revivals in the house of Buddha, the house of Islam, and the house of Hindu. Today, we believe that so many Muslims are going to come to Christ that they won't need to have a separate building that is allotted just for the church. We'll be taking over the mosque. That there'll be so many Buddhists coming to Christ that we won't need a separate building that will be taking over their temples. We will be able to take the places where the enemy has made for his worship, for the worship of Christ. This I've learned in the last couple of decades following the church, that it is the Spirit that makes a difference. It is the Spirit that makes changes. One of the most amazing chapters in the Bible, in my opinion, is John chapter 6. If you turn to John chapter 6, in John chapter 6, I'm only going to read one simple verse. In John chapter 6, verse 63. John chapter 6, verse 63. Jesus says this. My Bible might read a little bit different than yours, but it says, it is the Spirit that quickeneth. The flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. To understand the context here is that here in this verse, we see something that I believe is probably one of the darkest moments in the entire Bible. Right after Jesus said this, we see the verse, which is the only time in the New Testament that we see the verse 666. John chapter 6, verse 66. And I would argue it is perhaps one of the darkest verses in the entire Bible. John chapter 6, verse 66. After Jesus says these words, it says that the disciples turned and walked away. How many disciples did Jesus have? Most Sunday school classes will say there were 12. But actually, in John chapter 6, there were hundreds, if not thousands. We saw followers of Jesus that were following him wherever he went. We're right on the back at the beginning of chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle that is covered in all four Gospels. Then we have Jesus walking on the water. And those that are around see there's something special about him. And in the natural, people see the miracles that follow Jesus, so they too follow Jesus. But then Jesus begins to talk like a crazy man. He starts saying stuff like, eat my flesh, drink my blood. And the disciples that are following him are like, whoa, this is crazy stuff. I don't know what this means, but I'm not going to stay in this crowd. So they all left. And it was only the 12 that remained. And I love what Jesus said. Jesus didn't try to become cross-culturally appropriate. He didn't say, wait, guys, don't leave. You don't understand. Maybe I can break this down so that you can understand where I'm coming from and you can see my truth. Instead, he looks at the disciples and says, will you not leave as well? And the response was, where can we go? You have the bread of life. This bread of life that Jesus says is of the Spirit. Now, one of the things that I have learned while working together with the Underground Church, and I'll be sharing it a little bit tomorrow, is that when we see the Spirit moving, it changes the world around it. You know, so many times we want to see the governments change so that the churches can have more freedom. So many times we try to get one another to vote the right way, think the right way, join the right political party so that we can see the churches have freedom. And then once they have freedom, then they can really make a difference. But I would argue to you that it is not governments that give freedom to Christians, but it is Christians that give birth to free governments. And when we see that the Spirit begins to move, it does things that we can never do in the natural. You see, one of the things that I have learned while watching the Underground House Church is how God prepares answers when there was no way to prepare for that. He gives knowledge and wisdom and prophecy through His Spirit. I remember I was working together with a pastor that we brought to Sudan together with Jan. His name was Pastor Joshua. You remember Pastor Joshua? Pastor Joshua, I'd been working with him for many years, traveled all around the world with him, traveled to Europe and Africa, the Middle East, America. He and I had been working together for many years. And I was told a very special testimony about his life. I was told about a time when Pastor Joshua was arrested for preaching the gospel. And he was thrown in prison. And the warden hated Christians so much that he said, I want this prisoner, this pastor, this preacher of the gospel to be thrown into a prison cell with the worst criminals out there, and I want them to beat the tar out of him. So they put him in the worst prison cell with the worst criminals. And after a couple of days, when the warden came by to see how that prison cell was going, to see if that prisoner was still alive, he found that everyone in that prison cell had become believers. Now, the warden was so upset that he demanded that his guards pull Pastor Joshua out of that prison cell and beat him to every inch of his life. And when he was unconscious and they thought that he was dead, they dragged his lifeless body into another cell. And the warden told all of the prisoners to urinate and defecate on his lifeless, limp body there on the floor in the prison cell. Pastor Joshua, when he woke up, was laying on the only bed in the entire prison cell, with everybody in the prison cell looking over him and asking him, "Can you introduce us to your God?" He didn't know it, but while he was unconscious, laying on the floor, his lifeless, limp body on the cold concrete, a light shining from a place that they couldn't explain shined on his body. There was no window, there was no reflection. The prisoners, being very superstitious, did not know where that light was coming from. The prisoners, a little scared, grabbed his body and dragged it over to the only bed and put him on the bed, and the light followed. Now, I don't know where this fits in with your theology, but the rumor said that if you were sick in that prison, you could go and lay down in that bed and you would be healed from your disease. And many people tried it, and it worked. Now, there was a very important VIP prisoner who arrived. He was a political prisoner, and the government wanted to make a showcase of his trial. And when this very important prisoner arrived, it was the warden's responsibility to keep this VIP prisoner safe. That VIP prisoner got killed on his first day in prison. The warden knew that if the government officials find out that this man has died on my watch, I will be next. So he did the only thing that he knew to do in a time of panic. He was desperate, so he acted out in desperation, called for this pastor, had him brought to his office, asked Pastor Joshua. He said, "I heard that your God can bring people back from the dead. Can you help me bring this prisoner back to life?" And Joshua boldly, in the warden's office, said, "Yes, but you have to give your heart to Christ." Imagine, if you can, just for a moment, the warden who's in charge of the prison getting on his knees, and the prisoner who should be submitting to the warden is now standing over the warden and leading him to Christ. And the warden gave his heart to Christ, and the dead prisoner was brought back to life. Pastor Joshua never told me that story. The person that told me that story was the warden, who is now a member of Pastor Joshua's church. I remember I went to Pastor Joshua saying, "Joshua, are we not friends? We've traveled together for so many years. Is this story true?" He smiled and said, "Yes, it's true." And I said, "For so many years we've been close. For so many years we spend time talking about the most ridiculous subjects. And you've never told me?" I'm an American. I could have taken this story and written a book. I could have taken this story and had a 12-step program of how to do ministry in prison. I could have taken this story and made a movie. Why didn't you tell me this story? And he said, "Because God is doing so many greater things now, and he has so many greater things in the future to do if we obey his Spirit." And when I'm asking myself, how do we obey the Spirit? How do we follow the Spirit? How do we prepare for the Spirit? And as I watch the Chinese, I see a difference where you prepare the flesh, but you feed the Spirit. And how do you grow the Spirit? You grow the Spirit in the same way you grow your butt. You feed it. The more you feed it, the greater it gets. And I love when Moses went to God and said, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God says to Moses, "Tell them, I am sent you." I am? What does that even mean? I am. You know, when I came here to England, I had to show my passport. I had to show that an authority that is greater than me says that I am who I say I am. I have to have someone give me legitimacy because I am not big enough to legitimize myself. But there's no one greater than God. And when we are feeding on His Spirit, when He is giving us His Spirit, He is giving us legitimacy and power. And even though we may not have the resources that we think that we need, He is transforming nations. And we may not have the finances that we think that we need. We may not have the training that we think that we need. We may not have the skills that we think that we need. We may not have the resources that we think that we need. But if we have the Spirit, we can make a difference. Because it's not by might. It's not by power. It's not by money. It's not by people. It's not by training. It's by His Spirit, says the Lord. And that makes a difference. I am so thankful to be here together with you guys this evening. My hope is that tomorrow I'll be able to share a little bit more on how the Chinese are making a difference, and more importantly, what we can learn from the underground church today.